Some stories don't begin with screams or flashing police lights. They begin with very small things. A forgotten habit, an unanswered call, a familiar street suddenly becoming eerily silent. In a small town, where everyone knows each other, such things are never normal. And sometimes that very silence is a harbinger of a tragedy unfolding. The locals still talk about that morning. The sky was unremarkable. Just a pale yellow sunlight falling on the old eaves, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of damp grass, and the soft tinkling of wind chimes. But looking back now, everyone says they felt something had changed. An indescribable feeling, as if the town had held its breath. Every crime story has a moment when, if someone had realized it sooner, things might have been different. This is no exception. An ordinary family. Ordinary people. Their lives seemed perfectly normal, but sometimes fate takes just one wrong step, and their entire lives take an unexpected turn. When the incident occurred, people were bewildered, not just because of the unusual disappearance, but because they couldn't believe it could happen to the very person they had greeted at the shop door the day before. In a place where a morning greeting could warm the day, the fear deepened when tragedy struck a familiar face. And then the big question began to spread. What really happened in those final hours before everything changed? Who was the last person to see them? Why could a peaceful life shatter in the blink of an eye? This isn't just a case. This is a story about people, about the fears everyone carries, but never speaks of. And as we retrace each moment, each minute detail, perhaps the most agonizing thing isn't the final truth. It's the feeling that we missed something important long before the tragedy occurred. Before tragedy struck, life in that small town was so peaceful that people sometimes forgot the turbulent world outside. Cobblestone streets meandered through vast fields. Wooden houses stood silently through countless seasons of rain and sunshine. Every morning, smoke from old coffee stoves mingled with the cool air, carrying a warm aroma familiar from childhood. In that slow pace of life, the people believed in closeness. They believed in kindness. They believed that bad things always happened elsewhere, not here. Our protagonist also lives amidst that tranquility. A family that isn't wealthy, but is content in the way rural Americans often describe it. Enough to feel secure about tomorrow. Enough to believe that everything will be all right. They have a small but bright house. A porch where the late afternoon sun always falls upon laughter. Children running barefoot in the backyard. A mother who always wakes up earlier than the sun. A father who is quiet but kind. A family that neighbors often speak of, with admiration mixed with a touch of gentle envy. In places like this, people don't just live close together. They grew up together. They share simple things that are sometimes a luxury in the big city. A loaf of bread left at the door. A simple greeting when someone isn't at church on Sunday morning. Away from the bus driver who's known the children for years. Life revolves around these small things, but enough to make each person feel they belong here. For that family, everything unfolded in such a familiar rhythm that it was easy to think it would last forever. Simple dinners, filled with laughter. Strolls around the neighborhood, while the air still lingered with chill. Unfinished stories told on the porch. All of it blended together into an indescribable feeling. But the terrifying thing about tragedy is that it gives no warning. It creeps in on the most seemingly perfect days. It hides behind the most ordinary moments. And sometimes, it is precisely this overwhelming peace that prevents us from noticing the small changes that are quietly unfolding. In this town, people still believe that if they care enough and love enough, bad things won't come knocking at their door. But life doesn't operate according to simple beliefs. Some things accumulate silently over the years. There are small cracks that, before anyone notices them, have already opened up into a void that swallows an entire family. And looking back on those days, people still say they saw something in the eyes of these people. A hint of weariness. A hint of unspoken contemplation. Something like a thin cloud drifting across a clear blue sky. No one thought it was a sign. No one thought it was the beginning of a journey that the whole town would carry with it for many years to come. Because before tragedy, there are always very peaceful days. So peaceful that people don't realize they are standing right on the most fragile boundary of their lives. The cracks of tragedy rarely appear with loud noises. They often begin with things so small that they are easily overlooked. A change in gaze, a habit suddenly lost, a longer than usual silence at dinner. In this small town, it is believed that with enough perceptiveness, one can see through another's mood. But sometimes, those closest to us are the hardest to see. Neighbors said that in the weeks leading up to the incident, they had noticed the family seemed busier than usual. Not in a hurried, frantic way, but rather with a slight distraction. The mornings when the mother would smile and greet everyone at the end of the street were gone. The front door remained open, but the lively chatter was absent. The father, who usually stood outside in the yard every afternoon, now hurried inside, as if carrying a worry he didn't want anyone to see. At the small shop across from the residential area, the young shop assistant still vividly remembers the moment the mother came to buy groceries on a drizzly afternoon. She stood there for quite a while, looking at the list in her hand but seemingly not really seeing anything. When the shop assistant inquired, she only offered a faint smile and said she was feeling a little tired. A simple statement, but there was something different about her voice, as if her mind were somewhere far beyond this brightly lit room. The neighborhood children said they no longer heard the familiar laughter echoing in that family's backyard. No more afternoons of throwing balls or playing hide and seek. The wooden gate, always open, was now only slightly ajar. A small detail, but one that left a lasting impression. Because in towns like this, when children are silent, adults know something is changing. But the clearest sign came from a habit the whole neighborhood knew. The family always went to church together on Sunday mornings. They sat in the third row from the window. Always. But on the last Sunday before the tragedy, their empty seat caused many to stop and stare. The pastor even slowed his pace when he saw that row of seats. No one thought much of it. People said they must have been busy. Only when everything happened did that empty seat become a chilling image for everyone. What was remarkable about these small signs was that no one pieced them together at the time. Each person only saw a tiny fragment of the larger picture. A distant gaze, a closed gate, a smile that didn't reach the eyes, things that seemed unrelated. Until it was too late. Later, when people sat down and talked about those days, everyone said they had sensed something unusual. But sensing it was never enough to change fate, because sometimes the signs of tragedy don't come to warn us. They only come to remind us that even the most solid things can begin to crumble from the smallest things. That evening began like any other in town. The wind was calm. The porch lights cast a soft yellow glow on the wet grass. Families nearby were cleaning up after dinner. The smell of baked goods wafted through the open windows. The sound of television drifted from the house at the end of the street. A perfectly ordinary night, as the locals were accustomed to. Yet it was in these seemingly most peaceful nights that fate took an unexpected turn. Neighbors said the lights in their house were turned off later than usual. The father usually turned off the lights at a familiar time, a habit maintained for many years. But that night, light still shone through the curtains until almost midnight. No one thought it was a sign. They simply thought they had something to discuss or were busier than usual. But sometimes, a single change in routine is enough to mark the final moment when everything remains still. The most memorable moment was when there was a strange noise in the backyard. Not loud, not frightening. Just like someone hastily slamming a door or something hitting the wooden fence. A neighbor who stayed up late heard it and looked out the window. But the darkness in the family's backyard was so thick that nothing could be discerned. There was only a strange feeling, as if the silence was concealing something that didn't belong there. Even stranger was that their car was still parked neatly in the yard. The engine wasn't running. It hadn't moved. There was no sign of a hurried departure. For those accustomed to this family's routine, it was baffling. If they went out at night, they always left the porch lights on and always locked the gate. But that night, the lights were off, the gate was ajar, and there were no fresh footprints on the wet grass path. The next morning, what caught everyone's attention wasn't the chaos. It was the uncanny silence. The front door remained closed. No lights, no movement, no familiar footsteps. A neighbor called out loudly, but there was no answer. The mailman arrived as usual and noticed the mailbox was still untouched from the previous day. These small things combined to create an unsettling feeling that no one dared to name. When relatives called and no one answered, worry began to creep into everyone in the neighborhood. People knocked on doors. They called again. They looked out the windows. There was no sign of disturbance, no sign of anyone leaving. Just a house standing still, frozen in the flow of time. The first person to enter the house would later vividly remember the unsettling atmosphere that permeated everything. Unwashed dishes still lay in the kitchen. The hand towel lay askew on the table. The chairs were still in their places. A wall clock continued to tick, yet the entire house felt suffocatingly empty. As if someone had stepped outside for a very brief moment and never returned. No belongings were missing. There were no signs of struggle. No sounds were missed. Only emptiness. An emptiness so cold and stark that one understood something had happened in this place. Something no one in town wanted to face. What made the disappearance even more haunting was its inconsistency. Those who knew them said there was no reason for the family to vanish. No conflict, no debt, no trouble. Their lives were as stable as the town itself, and that was what frightened everyone the most. Because if a family like that could disappear in a windless night, it meant that anyone could become a victim of something unseen. When the police arrived and began taking details, the atmosphere in the entire neighborhood became somber. People looked at each other differently. Morning greetings faded. Children's laughter died down. Because in that moment, the small town understood that the peace they had once believed in had been shaken. Not by an explosion, but by an unexplained disappearance. When the news spread, the atmosphere in the small town changed overnight. The once peaceful streets, the porches where only the chirping of crickets and the sounds of children playing could be heard, were now filled with anxious whispers. Everyone felt an invisible string tighten around their chest. People looked at each other in silence, their eyes asking questions that no one dared answer. What had happened to them? And what was lurking behind the tranquil facade of this countryside? The victim's family suffered the most. Their house became a gathering place for neighbors, but inside, there remained a cold, empty space that no one could fill. The protagonist's mother, a woman who was once strong and simple, now sat silently at the old wooden table in the kitchen. She didn't cry aloud, but her eyes were always red, as if her tears had dried up since the first night. Every time someone opened the door, she would immediately turn around, clinging to the faint hope that the person entering would be the child she had waited her whole life. The victim's father, however, faced everything in a completely different way. He tried to remain strong, to keep his voice calm and composed to comfort his relatives. But when he stood alone on the porch, his hands trembled slightly. His eyes gazed at the long road leading to the fields, where he had once taken his child to school, where he had taught him how to drive the old car. He stood there as if he just looked long enough, his child would return. Meanwhile, the victim's friends began sharing small memories they had once thought would never matter. An afternoon of fishing, a time skipping school to throw stones at the stream, a joke during class. These trivial things suddenly became the only things that helped them cling to the image of the missing person. In the places they had been together, the atmosphere seemed to freeze. Each old moment became a painful, agonizing wound. The community wasn't just grieving. They were bewildered. They were terrified. Some were even angry, feeling helpless at their inability to protect their loved ones. Spontaneous search groups formed, with people carrying flashlights, maps, and ropes, traversing forests and streams wherever they could find a way. They called out to each other with sighs of despair. Each time they found a glimmer of hope, their hearts skipped a beat. But when hope crumbled, the group stood silently, looking at each other, speechless. In the evening, The town lights stayed on later than usual. In every house, people were still following the news. Every update from the police. Some children asked their parents why their friend hadn't come home. Some elderly people murmured prayers before going to sleep. This seemingly peaceful countryside was experiencing a storm, without wind or rain, but one that swept through every heart. And, amidst all this chaos, a shared emotion was growing. Determination. No one here was ready to let this story fade into oblivion. No one was willing to stand idly by and watch a family fall apart because of an endless wait. They wanted to find the truth, no matter how painful it might be. The early days of the investigation unfolded in a chaotic jumble of speculation, pressure, and faint hope. Local police, accustomed to handling petty thefts or family disputes, were now confronted with a sudden and inexplicable disappearance. They began with familiar steps, questioning neighbors, checking security cameras, and retracing every possible route the victim might have taken. But the more they followed each lead, the more disjointed everything seemed, like pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit together. Initially, a witness claimed to have seen the victim leave town with a strange man. The police clung to this detail like a drowning person grasping at a tree branch. They reconstructed the route. They knocked on numerous doors along the way, but the more they investigated, the less credible the witness's story became. Each time they were questioned, the details changed slightly. And, in missing person cases, just one inaccurate detail can send the entire investigation astray from the truth. And they wasted 3 precious days on a lead that led nowhere. Another line of reasoning led police to believe the victim might have left home due to personal pressure. They searched her phone, text messages, and diaries, looking for any signs of distress. But all they found was the image of a normal person, with minor life anxieties but no signs significant enough to cause them to abandon everything. Even so, this hypothesis was heartbreaking for the family. Nothing is more cruel than the thought that someone they love might have chosen to leave without a word. While the police were reeling from flawed theories, time didn't stand still. The first few hours, the first few days, are always precious in a missing person case. But each passing hour only made things heavier. The new reports were all the same: no clues, no signs of conflict, no suspicious individuals. The case gradually became a dark abyss that the lights of investigation couldn't reach. The deadlock wasn't just in the files. It permeated the hearts of everyone involved in the case. A young officer in the investigation team recounted how he frequently woke up in the middle of the night, wondering if he'd missed anything. He reviewed every piece of camera footage until he knew the movements of the passing vehicles by. But the victim remained as if they had never existed. The family also felt the impasse. Every day, the police would knock on their door, bringing thick reports filled with statements about finding nothing, adding to their despair. The victim's mother once said that she would rather hear bad news than remain trapped in a hopeless, murky situation. She wanted to know what had happened. She wanted to know where her child was, no matter how cruel the truth might be. The town began to split. Some believed the police were incompetent. Others thought people were exaggerating. Some suspected strangers. Others suspected even those familiar with the community. Suspicion spread like a cold wind in that land. And when trust wavered, hope was dragged down with it. By the end of the second week, the police were forced to admit they had been heading in the wrong direction. All the initial clues led nowhere. All the speculation only brought them back to square one. A disappearance without a trace, an illogical vanishing. A mystery that gripped the entire community. And that's when they realized that the hardest thing wasn't not finding anything, but not knowing where to look. After weeks of deadlock, when hope had become so fragile that it seemed a gentle breeze could extinguish it, something unexpected happened, and it came from an unexpected source. An elderly man living on the outskirts of town, who rarely interacted with the community, suddenly called the police near midnight. His voice trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the feeling that what he was about to say could change everything. He recounted that 2 days before the victim disappeared, he saw a dark-colored truck parked on a dirt road near the forest to the north. The vehicle was unfamiliar to anyone in the area. The driver sat in the shadows for quite a while, as if observing something or waiting for someone. What he remembered most was that the headlights were off, but the engine was still running at a very low volume, almost as if deliberately concealing it. Initially, he didn't tell anyone, thinking it was just a stranger who had gotten lost. But after learning about the disappearance, the image kept recurring in his mind, preventing him from sleeping. He felt a responsibility to speak out, even if it was just a small detail. When the police finished listening, the entire meeting room fell silent for a few seconds. No one spoke a word, not because the clue was so obvious, but because this was the first time something truly different had emerged. A completely new direction, a small glimmer of light in the thick darkness of the case. The very next morning, the investigation team immediately went to the area the man had described. The dirt road was narrow and winding, lined on both sides with tall, silent trees. The wind blew strongly, rustling the leaves like whispers of old forest stories. The police turned on their flashlights, sweeping across the ground, clearing away clumps of grass along the roadside. And then, after only a few minutes, a young officer called out loudly. Beneath the dry, hardened ground were tire tracks. Not many. Not very clear. But enough. Some sections were blurred by the rain, but the rest indicated the car had stopped for a considerable time, the rear wheels sinking deeper than the front. This suggests the driver didn't simply stop because they took a wrong turn. They had a purpose. When the forensic team arrived, they began scanning the area with infrared equipment. After nearly an hour, a small detail emerged on the screen. A metal object lay deep in the grass, so small it was barely visible to the naked eye. When it was picked up, everyone standing around fell silent. It was a scratched keychain. The victim's initials were engraved on it. The moment was suffocatingly heavy. An officer clenched his gloved hand as if to hold tightly to that small piece of evidence. He understood that this might be the first sign that the victim was actually here, that the disappearance was no longer an invisible mystery. It had a form, a path, a starting point. As the keychain was placed in the evidence bag, a mix of emotions surged through everyone. A feeling of hope, anxiety, and fear that the truth might be far more brutal than they imagined. But whatever the case, they knew the investigation had taken a different turn. The investigation was no longer at a standstill. The team looked at each other, as if they had finally heard a call from the darkness, and they understood that from this moment on, things would never be the same again. When the keychain was found, the investigation entered a whole new chapter. Layers of mystery began to unfold like pages blown away by the wind, and amidst it all, the truth gradually emerged. The police reviewed the list of people who had been around the area, those who had passed along the dirt road in recent weeks. And it was in that seemingly unremarkable list that they found a name that had been mentioned briefly many times but had never been noticed. It was a man who had worked with the victim years before, someone who had been involved in a small project they had both participated in. Initially, he wasn't considered a suspect because there was no clear reason to link him to the disappearance. But when the files were reopened, one detail silenced the entire meeting room. 6 months earlier, a seemingly simple conflict had arisen between them. An unintentional remark, a minor argument about work-related benefits. But for someone carrying deep emotional wounds, small things can sometimes carry far greater weight. The police immediately questioned him. When asked about the date the victim disappeared, he gave a concise answer. So concise, it lacked naturalness. His face showed little emotion, but his eyes were different. They didn't flinch, but neither did they offer genuine honesty. It was as if he were trying to control something that threatened to erupt from deep within. The investigation didn't stop there. When checking traffic cameras more than 10 miles from where the tracks were found, police saw a truck that matched the witness's description. The license plate also matched that of the man. That was the moment everyone realized they were closer to the truth than ever before. After hours of questioning, he finally sighed and let go of everything he had tried to hide. Not with a dramatic confession, but with the exhaustion of someone who had held on to things he shouldn't have for too long. He said he didn't intend to harm anyone. He said it all started with a desire to talk, to explain, to resolve misunderstandings that he believed had led his life down a terrible path. But in that tense moment, pent-up anger and accumulated feelings of injustice had led him too far. His motive wasn't greed, not a sophisticated criminal plan. It was hurt, a feeling of abandonment, the belief that he had been deprived of something important, things that others might consider insignificant, but which meant the world to him. When the final explanation fell, the room was so silent that you could hear the clicking of the handcuffs on the table. An old officer, who had been in the profession for 30 years, softly said that the motive was what choked him the most. Because it didn't belong to obvious evils, it belonged to the dark corners of each person, places so vulnerable that even a small scratch could create tragedy. And as the truth was revealed, the victim's family was also informed. They didn't burst into tears. They were simply silent. Because sometimes what hurts people the most isn't knowing who the culprit is, but understanding that this tragedy wouldn't have happened if an honest conversation had taken place sooner. If the hurt hadn't been hidden, if the cracks in someone's heart had been seen earlier, the truth has emerged. The motive is clear. But what remains in the end is not just the crime. It's the fragility of seemingly harmless emotions, enough to plunge both lives into darkness. The district courthouse was packed with people that morning. No one seemed curious. Only the weariness and heaviness of those who had lived too long in doubt. They hadn't come to witness a verdict. They had come to find a sense that justice still existed, however fragile it was, sometimes feeling as if it could shatter in their hands. The defendant was led in amidst an eerie silence. He bowed his head, not to avoid the press, but because he lacked the courage to look at the family of the deceased. There was no defiance or anger on his face, only the emptiness of a man who had lost himself long before the tragedy occurred. As the trial began, the prosecutor presented the evidence that the police had spent weeks piecing together. The keychain, tire marks, traffic camera footage, and the defendant's fragmented testimony about that fateful evening. Each word was like a knife cutting through the silence of the courtroom. But what weighed most heavily on everyone wasn't the evidence. It was the way the defendant listened silently, as if each detail reminded him of a mistake he wished he could erase at all costs. When he was finally allowed to speak, he stood up. His hands trembled slightly. His voice was so soft that the judge had to ask him to move closer. He said that he wasn't perfect. He said that he had carried his anger inside for so long that it had become something he couldn't control. He said that he never intended to take a life. He just wanted to be heard. Just wanted to be respected. Just wanted someone to understand how hurt he had been. But then, when he recounted his final moments with the victim, the courtroom fell silent. He said they had argued, that the tension had caused him to lose control. But he also said something that made everyone look up almost simultaneously. He said he had left while the person was still alive. The prosecutor immediately objected, but the judge ordered the defendant to finish speaking. He recounted that after leaving, he drove onto the main road. When he turned around, he saw another figure standing next to the victim, someone he initially thought was just a passerby. Then he uttered a sentence that sent chills down everyone's spine in the courtroom. I wasn't sure if I saw the truth then, or just what I thought I saw. I was afraid that if I spoke out, no one would believe me anymore. A wave of commotion rose from the seats below. The victim's family exchanged glances. A small but dangerous glimmer of hope flickered. If a second person had appeared at the scene, what had really happened after the defendant left? The defense attorney immediately requested further investigation. But the prosecutor presented a detail that brought the room to a standstill. In the victim's phone, a few days before her disappearance, there was a previously undisclosed message. A message from an old acquaintance, expressing annoyance about an unpaid debt. The message had been deleted from a backup but had been recovered at the last minute. The person matched the defendant's vague description of the figure he had seen. No one in the courtroom was expecting that turn of events. It didn't change the entire case, but it opened up the possibility that the truth was far more complex than initially imagined. The trial was adjourned. The defendant was not acquitted, but he was no longer the only one under suspicion. As he was being led away, he turned back to look at the victim's family. No plea for forgiveness, no final words. Just a look filled with remorse and something akin to a desire to be freed from a burden he had carried for too long. And at the back of the courtroom, in the silent rows of seats, someone suddenly stood up. No one knew who it was, but his face briefly changed expression when he heard the mysterious message. That was the moment everyone in the room knew. The truth wasn't over. There was another figure in this story, another hidden corner, a secret yet to be revealed. Time passed, but the people in that story didn't move on easily. In the small town where people once believed tragedy only happened in distant places, this event left a very real scar. It was in the eyes of those passing by the courtroom, in the interrupted conversations, in the unspoken feeling that they were trying to rediscover lost faith. The victim's family returned home after the trial with an indescribable feeling. They didn't experience complete relief, but they were no longer as desperate as before. The pain didn't disappear, it only transformed. It became a heavy feeling that the answers they sought remained somewhere out of reach. The victim's mother placed the photograph back on the wooden table by the window. She no longer wiped away her tears. She just sat silently, as if wanting to converse with someone she believed was still watching over her family from somewhere else. The father tried to appear strong, but his shoulders were always slightly slumped, as if carrying a burden he couldn't share with anyone else. He walked more, along the streets his son used to walk, stopping at the small shops they used to frequent. People said he didn't smile as much anymore. But on some days, he would still greet his neighbors with a deeper, softer voice than before, as if he understood better the sense of loss someone might be hiding. And the community learned to live with that story in their own way. Morning cafes became quieter. Weekend nights were more peaceful. Children were told to go home earlier, not because they were afraid of the dark, but because they understood that people can sometimes harbor hidden aspects that others don't recognize. And that caution is sometimes the only thing that makes people feel safe in a world full of uncertainties. As for the defendant, he was detained at the county's correctional center. They said he was taciturn. He often sat by the window looking out at the concrete courtyard with an unreadable gaze. Not the gaze of someone trying to escape the truth, but the gaze of someone trying to look back at himself. He wrote letters, not to anyone, just to keep himself sane. He wrote about things he wished he could change, about moments he wanted to go back and choose silence instead of reproach, choose to walk away instead of confront, choose calmness instead of letting hurt guide him. Even the police couldn't escape the aftermath of the case. Veteran investigators, those accustomed to tragedy, would sometimes stand in parking lots wondering if they'd seen the whole truth. Had something been overlooked? Had someone else remained silent? Some admitted to having trouble sleeping. Not out of fear, but because they were haunted by the thought that even a small, overlooked detail could have changed the entire story. But life goes on, as it always has. Cars still travel along the road where the first traces were found. Late afternoons still cast long shadows on the trees along the lake. Children still run and play on the lawns that adults watch with more caution than before. The echoes remain, but people learn to prevent them from overwhelming them. They hold on to them as a reminder that human fragility is real, that a wrong decision can shake a life to its core, and that, sometimes, the most painful thing isn't the ending. It's what remains afterward, silently and deeply ingrained, forcing each person to look back at themselves before looking out at the world. There are crime stories that don't just end in the courtroom, but live on in the memories of those who witnessed them. This case is no exception. It reminds us that evil sometimes doesn't come from a distant darkness, but from a small crack in the heart of someone very familiar. And what makes it most terrifying isn't the moment the crime occurred, but the prolonged silence that followed. As communities return to their normal lives, and the media stops mentioning the name that once shocked them, there are still hearts that cannot return to normal. Their pain serves as a reminder that each person carries within them a fragile world, one that needs to be heard and protected. If there's one thing we can learn from this story, it's that the truth always finds a way to come to light, however slow and tiring. And at the end of every tragedy, there's always room for compassion. Because sometimes, the only thing left to hold us together is the ability to understand and the love we have for others.